Off the top of your head, could you name like one or two Superman stories, like comic stories that have the Toyman that's relevant? Or a story that you can recall?
I can't think of any from the comics. I think, for the most part, the main stories I remember from Toyman are all from Superman the Animated Series, and then there's the scene in Superman Doomsday.
Yeah.
But in that scene, fake Superman kills him, so it's like, talk about villain of the week. He was villain of the minute at that point.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here with me today, Adam. I already started recording because I was like, oh, this is juicy. But it has been quite some time since we've recorded, because we did record the Last Son of Krypton, parts 1 through 3.
Yep.
That was forever ago. The audio isn't super great. I'm going to try to go back through it and tweak it a little bit to see if I can make it sound any better. But for all intents and purposes, I would like this to be the general point where people can just jump on and get more Superman in their lives.
Oh, yeah. I went back and I listened to the audio from the other ones, too. Because I went back and I listened to part 3 while I was driving home. And the audio in part 3 really wasn't all that bad. You know that feeling where you just can't get over the sound of your own voice on recording?
Yes.
That's what I can't get past. I can't get past the whole my voice, you know?
That's how I feel every time I start editing it. I was like, oh, this is what I sound like. But I'm hoping to begin doing this a little more frequently. I would like to, for whoever is actually listening, I would like to do this twice a month. I want to alternate. If I have more time, I'll try to do more than 2 episodes a month. I would like to alternate 2 Batman episodes per 1 Superman episode, because there's like 108 episodes of BTAS and like 50-something of STAS.
Yeah, something like that. It's 3 seasons, and then for Batman the Animated Series, you've also got the New Adventures, which is included in Batman the Animated Series. So it's almost like 4.5 seasons of Batman the Animated Series versus 3 very short seasons of Superman the Animated Series.
But they have a lot to offer, which I am very excited to get through.
Oh yeah, there's like connected movies and stuff with them too that are like, it's just really good.
Is there a Superman the Animated Series movie? Or a movie geared towards that?
Yes, Superman Brainiac Attack.
Okay.
Is the main one that is part of that universe. Batman has a couple more than that, because Batman has Mystery of the Batwoman, Sub-Zero,
Phantasm,
which is such a good movie. But my favorite was always Sub-Zero.
Yes.
Because I've always really enjoyed Mr. Freeze as a character, because he's not really a bad guy.
It always reminds me of the Wreck-It Ralph bit, where they're all in their, like, villain support group, and then Zangief is like, just because you're a bad guy doesn't make you a bad guy.
Right, exactly. Some people just have reasons. Some people are just out to see the world burn, like people like the Joker, Mxyzptlk, Toyman. There are characters like that that are just crazy for their own reasons. And then you have characters like Lex that are just, they're out for a business venture. They're not necessarily evil, but they're not necessarily good people either. They're looking for the next money grab. Lex is a businessman at heart. He's not good or bad. And then he views Superman as the enemy because he doesn't trust him, because he's not human.
He's an opportunist.
That's the word I was looking for. I couldn't find it. And then you have characters like Mr. Freeze. All he wants is to save his wife. That's all he wants. And he'll do whatever he has to do to get to that point.
Well, speaking of characters, their morality, their villainy for whichever reason, I'm going to segue right into Fun and Games, the 4th episode of Superman the Animated Series, which introduces the Toyman. The episode opens with an armored car chase throughout the streets of Metropolis. There's an armored tank. It's beelining from the police, and while the police are hot on their trail, one of the goons hops out of the tank and throws a gas canister onto the road, and it creates a smoke screen. And they're able to ditch the cops and veer off. Superman makes his appearance somewhere up on the skyline. He overhears the policeman saying that they lost the criminals at some street and some street.
Right, and it's really cool to think about the fact that Superman's already developing like these ways to kind of keep on top of things. Like, he's a reporter because of the fact that he wants to hear about things as they happen, not after they happen. So that's part of why he became a reporter. But at the same time, you see him sitting on the skyline listening because his hearing is just so powerful that he just listens to the entirety of the city. And eventually, you get to the point to where in the comics, he's listening to the entire world. You get to that point, but right now we're seeing a Superman that's just trying to protect where he is. He's not developed to that point yet because he's still very new.
I see what you mean whenever you said that you know how we are if we start talking about something, because as soon as you brought that up, I was like, oh, in that Man of Steel by Bendis, whenever he was flying around the city, he heard some girl singing a cover of a song to one of her friends, and how vulnerable and like how special that was, and I was like, incredible.
Yeah, because eventually he develops his hearing to the point to where, he hears everything. But the muscles that control his ability to hear, he can fine-tune them to the point to where he can hear pinpoint accuracy where something is. Another part of Bendis' run, you have these two criminals from Gotham that are meeting up in Metropolis, and they're talking about, villain stuff. And he's like, dude, you know whose city this is. He's going to hear us. And he's like, no, I did my research. He's all the way across the world. And yet Superman still shows up and scoops him up. But even though he's halfway across the world, he's still going to show up when it comes to Metropolis.
So returning to the episode, with his pinpoint hearing, he is able to, after a while, locate the criminals. But cutting over to the criminals, they make it to some sort of warehouse, and they get out, and they're celebrating their successful heist, until from the shadows, a man, I can't say dressed up as a doll, because it's an entire suit that he is in, and I really enjoy how, animation-wise, there are light reflections on his skin and parts of Toyman's body, so you can tell that it's not matte like our skin, it is some sort of plastic that he is wearing, and I'm like, that's kind of weird.
It's almost porcelain.
But from the shadows, holding a ball, the Toyman emerges, introducing himself. He informs the henchmen to inform their boss, Mr. Mannheim, that he's calling timeout on his little games, and then he drops the ball. And it starts to bounce higher and higher, and then the criminals try and charge Toyman. They try to rush after him, but they get to the door that he left out of, and it's locked. And then the toy ball begins to bounce, higher, bounce faster and faster. It gains momentum. It breaks some of the pipes in the room. It breaks the power box in the room. It collides with one of the men, and it takes him down, and I'm like, oh, that looked painful.
Right.
And then they retreat to the tank, and they're convinced that because the tank is made out of steel, that it is going to be A-okay. And then as the ball gains more momentum, it starts to dent the steel-plated car, and they just start screaming for help.
Yeah, and one of the crazy things that I noticed in this episode with my most recent watch-through is they did a really good job with the pacing of the episode, especially for this part, because the hits with the ball hit at the same time as certain parts of the background music. I don't know if you've noticed that through any of your playthroughs. You feel the music build as it gains momentum, and it's interesting because of the fact that you feel along with the ball that there's momentum being gained by the ball, because it's destroying different, more powerful things as it continues to move.
As the criminals are calling out for help, Superman's flying through the sky and he can hear them. He dives through the ceiling, he surveys the area, and the ball's just bouncing in the background until it collides with Superman. It catches him off guard the first time. I'm always amused by anything and anyone that moves Clark Kent and moves Superman, because I've seen in certain comics, or maybe it was sometime in the animated series, where he talks about he has to allow himself to be moved by things, or else it might break the person or the thing that is acting upon him.
I think he mentions that in both the comics and I think it's All-Star Superman, I want to say. I feel like he mentions it in the comics for All-Star Superman, and then I think he also mentions it in the movie. If it's not All-Star Superman, then it might be Superman Unbound, which is another Brainiac film. It's funny how a lot of the animated films are all about Brainiac.
And yet we have zero Brainiac live-action movies.
Yet. We're hopeful. I'm very hopeful that eventually we will get a live-action Brainiac, and I just hope that they do it well, because Brainiac is such a good villain. But because of the fact that we're talking about Toyman in this episode, I also hope that eventually we do get a good live-action Toyman that really does the character justice for him, because he's a very underrated character. And I also wanted to point out with Superman being caught off guard by the ball. It's interesting because of how early it is in his career as Superman that things can still catch him off guard and can still knock him back. Even though you and I both know it probably didn't hurt. It more than likely didn't hurt.
Probably didn't even tickle. It was just surprising.
It's like if somebody walks behind you and they poke you. It's like the poke doesn't hurt, but you're still going to recoil because you felt it. And he gets hit a couple of times before he's like, okay. And then that's when he really surveys the room as the ball is bouncing. And then you see him do what the Flash would do. A thing that the Flash does a lot in terms of he's studying the pattern of how it's moving because you can watch his eyes move. And then eventually he's able to he figures out where the ball's going to end up and catches it between his hands. And he smashes it. And you realize that it's not a very powerful ball because Superman just turns it to dust. But at the same time, this ball just made a steel armored car and turned it into mush.
After Superman claps the ball and turns it to dust, all the criminals within the van are like, oh, thank God, it's over. They're about to rejoice until their tank is lifted off the ground, and then Superman flies it to the police station.
Yeah, they had zero chance to really have any sort of relief before they're like, wait a second. The car's moving again. What's going on? And then they're just dropped off in front of the police station. Superman doesn't give them time to say thank you. He's just like, oh, well, this is also the armored car I was looking for. What a coinky-dink. And just takes it over to the police station.
At the police station, a crowd gathers around the armored car as the criminals are being carried out on stretchers. And one of the criminals deliriously starts to mutter that Toyman is calling a timeout, and then he, trails off. With the Batman I've been watching, Batman is a detective, that is his shtick, but we get so much investigating with this show as well because Lois and Clark are reporters. It's a cool detail that even though Batman's the world's greatest detective, Superman's no slouch. Superman's also a detective.
In his own right. It also makes you appreciate the shows more because this is a lot of stuff that we don't get from the live-action versions of these characters. We don't get a whole lot of the reporter side of Clark from the live-action versions of these characters. We get it from the comics and we get it from the animated shows, but we don't even get it from the animated movies. And you don't get a lot of the detective side of Batman from animated movies or from the movies as much as you do from the shows and even from the comics. And it's interesting to think about that because a lot of these characters that we see in the films, they get a whole lot more fleshed out on TV, and they're getting more fleshed out than movies that are made for adults.
One of the coolest details added to the Batman v Superman, the Ultimate Edition, was the scene with Clark Kent where he goes to Gotham to do reporter things. And I was like, oh my gosh, because it's his job. And he shows up in Gotham to try to ask people about the Batman and how some people are super terrified of the Batman. But to other people, he's their twisted symbol of justice in this part of the world.
Right. It was really good to see that and to see that side of the character was being done justice at some point in filming. Even if it was originally cut and they gave it back to us, at least we got it. It's just really nice to see parts of characters that you don't often see being done justice in a way that's very pleasing to the character.
So, returning to the episode, as I said, there's a crowd gathered around the car, and they're wheeling off the criminals in stretchers. Jimmy Olsen's taking pictures of the car, and Lois is with him, and they have a fun back and forth, and Jimmy's like, what a smash-up, and Lois responds that it's an odd thing. She heard that the car was parked at the time, and he says, where, a monster truck rally? It's a cute interaction between the two of them.
I listened to you and Kevin talking about the last Joker episode for Batman the Animated Series.
Yes.
And it's really interesting the parallels between Toyman and the Joker, especially with this episode and the episode that y'all talked about with the most recent posting. It's interesting to see those parallels and how Toyman has a lot of the same childish puns and humor that the Joker uses against Batman in the most recent episode that y'all talked about.
The last laugh.
How they're well written. They're good jokes for kids, but they're delivered so well that they can still make you laugh no matter how old you are.
So, Lois tries to interrogate one of the criminals. His name was Spider, asking for the lowdown on the Toyman, quote-unquote, and what's their boss, Bruno Mannheim, have to do with it. But the criminal claims that he happens to be an independent agent, and then he's taken away. Jimmy asks where they're headed next, and Lois is like, well, I was kind of thinking about a picnic in the park. And I was like, what? And then it transitions to a park where Bruno Mannheim is announcing it for the public. And we see Clark is there. And when Lois shows up with Jimmy, she asks if he's enjoying a leisurely day at the park or if he's been listening to the police band again. And I'm like, is this a thing Clark does? Or like, is this like an excuse that he uses as to why he's where at whatever point in time? But Clark is none the wiser, and he's like, no, Harry sent me here to cover the park opening. And then Jimmy starts to give a little details as to what's going on, and Lois like, no, Smallville, this is mine.
Right. It goes back to what we said about their Lois and Clark's playful banter from the first 3 episodes, where it's not necessarily that I don't want to share the byline. It's neither one of us want to share the byline because we want the story to ourselves. In a reporter's mindset, a lot of times I feel like they probably don't like to share bylines because of the fact that it's one of those things where I did all this work and you come in partway through and now I have to share all this work with you that I already did for you to take part of the credit, even though you did nothing to come up with that part. You come up with some stuff later on, but you did nothing towards this part, but yet I have to give you part of the credit for it.
Lois isn't about it. Neither is Kent, which I appreciate the rivalry.
Right, it's great. It's funny how even in the comics, they still have that rivalry. Every version of Lois and Clark, they have that rivalry even once they're married, once they're together. They still have that small little reporter rivalry, and it doesn't get in the way of their relationship. Work is at work, home is at home, and they still have that playfulness that actually builds their relationship, and it's really kind of cool.
After Lois shows Jimmy out of the way, saying that she wanted the byline for herself, I almost wasn't going to say it, but we get the cheekiest grin from Clark, because he was already kind of smiling, but he grins wider. I'm like, he's enjoying this. I was like, I'm glad that I feel like it's kind of difficult. I guess I don't know, but I feel like it might be kind of difficult to portray chemistry with animated characters, but they do it very well with the two of them.
Oh, yeah. I agree with you in a lot of ways that it's kind of difficult that without certain forms of writing, it can be very difficult to show that kind of chemistry, especially in a kid's show. But they do a really, really good job. They always do a really good job of writing Batman and Catwoman. And it's very similar with Lois and Clark, that they do a fantastic job of displaying that sort of chemistry between those characters. And I think it's just because of the fact that over many years of those characters being written, those characters were written to be together, whether or not they're together or not.
Yeah. So Lois approaches Mr. Mannheim and begins to ask about that morning's events. And he deflects with, why would I have a comment? I'm a legitimate businessman. I'm like, you should not say that to anybody. You also should not say that to a Lois Lane. Not suspicious at all. But as that continues, Clark spots a small fleet of toy planes starting to circle the area, and then they begin firing at Bruno. And setting the scene, this is the park opening of Mannheim Park. There's this stage that Bruno was on, then he came off to talk to Lois. There are just all sorts of picnic tables with food and beverages, etc., strewn about. But with these toy planes, they come down, they start firing at everything, and they start tearing up all the tables, and Clark tackles Bruno out of the way. And Jimmy is hiding while taking photos, which I incredibly respect, because, I don't know, he's out there in the field, he's like, wow, this is dangerous, but this is a front cover photo, so I'm here for it. Already better than Peter Parker. Peter Parker's got a lot to back him up, and he can only get the things he does because he's Spider-Man, but Jimmy Olsen's, he's out there. He's doing his job.
Yeah, Jimmy Olsen has no powers. He has absolutely nothing, except for a camera, and he uses that camera.
After taking the pictures, he warns everybody that the planes are coming back. So I googled this maneuver, the thing the planes did. They inclined and then they turned around and came back, because I've seen plane movies and I've seen that happen before, and I was like, there must be a term for this. So I googled it, and it's called a rollover. That was the maneuver that the planes made when the aircraft pulls up at about 60 degrees until it almost stalls, and then it makes an 180 degree turn and it comes back. And I was like, that's cool. Comics teach you something.
Yeah.
I did this last episode too. I'm trying to find something in each episode that can be a learning moment, because comics teach
Oh, comics teach a whole bunch. This actually connects really well because in the old Superman, the comic strip that they would do back when it was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, back when they were writing for the newspaper and putting Superman in the newspaper, they would include little tidbits of actual information. Oh, well, Superman just lifted this. But they would compare Superman's feet to different animals, different bugs, all kinds of different insects and stuff. Like, there was one with ants, because ants can lift something 3 times their size. And they did one for grasshoppers, because grasshoppers jump really high. And back then, Superman couldn't fly, but he could leap tall buildings.
In a single bound. Yeah.
So it's interesting because comics really do teach you something because, in a way, comics were meant for us to grow up with. And a lot of us self-deemed or not self-deemed nerds and geek, whatever kind of names you want to have, a lot of us hold on to it because they meant so much to us and they taught us a lot. And in a way, they connect more than just good storytelling for a lot of people. Because a lot of the knowledge that I have, a lot of the information that I've gleaned over years of living, a lot of it came from comic books.
I remember for my AP Lang writing portion of my exam, I don't remember what the topic was, but I wrote something about Superman, and I got a 3, so somebody enjoyed the paper, and I was like, good enough. But back to the episode, I really like in the days of the commercial break, the planes, whenever they do the rollover, go up, almost all turn back around. The plane flies into the camera, and like the barrel takes up the camera, and then it goes to black. That's a really cool transition to a commercial break.
Yeah.
So the planes continue to chase after Bruno, and Clark tries to pursue him, but Lois pulls him back behind one of the tables. And this is, again, another thing of Superman really just lets people yank him around. Effort had to go into allowing Lois to pull him down. But Bruno just starts booking it towards a slide in the park while being fired upon, and he crawls inside the bottom of the slide, and he starts to crawl up the slide. It's just being shot at, and then the slope collapses, and then you see Bruno's butt and legs hanging out, and he's stuck in the slide, and the planes do another rollover, and they're going up, and they're coming back around to take out Bruno, and then Clark lowers his glasses, and he uses his heat vision and takes out all 3 of the planes. I really appreciate the detail because I've seen in some cartoons where he uses heat vision, he'll like use it through his glasses, but I appreciate that he like lowered his glasses because I was like, it will destroy his glasses.
Not only that, when I think about that, I also think about characters like Cyclops who also have vision-related abilities. Because Cyclops isn't really heat vision, it's more of a blast. You know, it's one of those things where Superman lowers the glasses because when you think about science, if he would shoot it through the glasses, it would no longer just be that straight beam. It would fire outward because it would refract.
Yep.
Think about it in terms of like the kid with the magnifying glass with ant. A little beam turns into a big beam turns into a little beam.
I'm trying, not super hard, but I'm trying to keep this linear, but so many things pop up, as you say. When we talk, it's just gonna go off the rails. There's some comic where Cyclops' abilities are like explained. He doesn't shoot lasers. His eyes are portals to a dimension of kinetic energy. And while that sounds so stupid, that's a very original idea. I've never even thought of something like that.
Yeah, it's completely original, and it's really cool. I've actually gotten into internet troll arguments with people that want to argue about Cyclops, because even though he can be kind of a mean person at times, kind of a bit of a
D-I-C-K, yeah, I understand.
Yeah, he has his issues, but he is my favorite X-Men, and I've gotten into arguments over it before, because they're like, well, his only superpower is heat vision, and it's like, Cyclops doesn't have heat vision. Now, if he uses the kinetic blast right, it gets really, really hot because it's kinetic energy.
Yep.
But depending on the intensity, because that's what his visor is for. His visor is to control the intensity of the blast because he can't control it himself. He was born with the ability to control it, but because he fell out of a plane, he lost that ability when he got a concussion.
No, that'll do it.
His optic blast can be used as like a punch.
Punchbeams.
Right. It's essentially a punch that he can vary in intensity, and depending on the varying intensity, if he hits you hard enough, it'll be hot and it'll burn. So it'll act like heat vision even though it's not heat vision.
Sorry for our X-Men tangent in the Superman the Animated Series episode. So, after the planes are taken out, Lois wonders what happened, and Jimmy assumes that they just broke down, while Bruno is in the background screaming, like, it's muffled because he's stuck in the slide, but he's, like, shouting for them to get him out of there. It transitions to the Daily Planet, where Lois is gloating to Clark that she got the byline, telling him to read it and weep. The attack on the armored car, the attack on Mannheim, and the preliminary profile of the Toyman by police psychiatrists. And this is a really cool portion of the episode, where she begins to read the newspaper, and she declares that someone who uses toys as weapons must have serious issues. An emotionally stunted, amoral narcissist with paranoid delusions, and then it transitions to the Toyman reading the newspaper, and it's only for a few seconds. It just finishes the sentence. He continues, desperately seeking external validation through antisocial behavior. And then you just see the Toyman look up, and then it transitions to the next scene with Bruno Mannheim. I really liked that. They didn't have to do that. Like, they could have just had her read the entire paper and then transition to... In one of the episodes in the Batman the Animated Series, we see somebody looking at a newspaper, and then it transitions to Batman in the Batcave with the newspaper. And I was like, cool.
Synchronicity?
It's just very cool. It's just a very good transition.
Right. And I completely agree. They do that in movies sometimes, too, where two different people are reading the same thing, but they're reading it with different connotations, where it's like one person likes what they're reading and the other person really, really doesn't. And you can tell Toyman really doesn't like the feeling of being called out.
So we transition to Bruno Mannheim, and he's with his henchmen on a yacht. As the henchmen are playing cards, Bruno questions how could they let the Toyman get so close to him, and then they're like, boss, you ordered us not to enter the park. Like, you said we steer away the kids. And Bruno just continues to pout, and he, like, throws something on their card game. I was like, what a jerk. And then he looks over into the water, and then the water begins to bubble, and then a giant, not-so-rubber ducky emerges from the water. And Bruno tells his henchmen to fire at it, and again, the henchmen are kind of taking, like, MVPs of this episode. They're like, it's a giant duck, sir. And I was like, yes. He said it's just a big ducky. They do fire at it, but it doesn't do anything, and then the duck begins to smash the boat with its beak, destroying it and forcing Bruno to swim to land. As soon as Bruno reaches land, the duck just tails him, and before it can smash him, Superman arrives and stops the duck. Superman begins to battle with the duck as he knocks it backward, and the duck lifts up its wings that has two little barrels, and it shoots missiles at Superman. And I was like, oh yes, the classic duck wing missiles.
This is another great moment where Superman isn't necessarily hurt, but he's taken aback because he gets hit by the missiles and they knock him back a little bit, but it's not because of the fact that it hurt him. It doesn't hurt. It's just, oh, I just got shot by missiles. There's going to be a little bit of recoil, especially because of the fact that he's in midair. It's not like he's catching them while he's on the ground. There's no support behind him. It's just him. So it's one of those things where it just physically makes sense that even though this is Superman, and Superman, he's supposed to be his unwavering force, it makes sense because of how early he is in using his powers. He hasn't developed enough to know this is how much force I need to use in order to combat the fact that I just got hit by a missile.
Yes.
Because up to this point, yeah, he might have been hit by a missile before, but he hasn't been hit by this missile. So he's still learning and adjusting to this world that's made of cardboard around him.
Over with Bruno, he runs away only to come face to face with the Toyman, who's holding a giant bubble wand. And Toyman asks him, as he dips his wand into the bubble solution, how does the saying go, bubble, bubble, toil and trouble? As he starts waving the wand, making giant bubbles. And this is our first hint towards solving this mystery. Bruno calls him Winslow because he recognizes the same creepy voice. He doesn't know how he came back from the dead, but he assures the Toyman that it's going to be a short visit, which is a pretty cool threat. I don't really like you, Bruno Mannheim, but that was kind of a cool line. And he pulls out his gun, but the bubbles burst, releasing sleeping gas, and it knocks Bruno out. And back with Superman, he starts punching some of the missiles, and then he tanks a few of them once he's back on the ground, and then he tackles the duck into the water, destroying it. And then he flies to the sky searching for Bruno, only to find a gun on the ground and the giant bubble wand.
It's kind of interesting how in cartoons you don't see a lot of variation in the weapons that they're using. Like in superhero cartoons, 9 times out of 10, the henchmen, they're all using handguns. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if they're shooting at Batman, Superman. A lot of them are just using handguns. Mannheim is carrying a handgun. It's just a very interesting idea that even though there's all these different variations, and in real life, henchmen carry all sorts of different things. If you're in a gang in real life, the way that Intergang would operate inside of the comics and inside of the DC universe, if you were in an operation such as that, you would be armed with a whole lot more. Because Intergang is supposed to be this very advanced gang where it's, you can't connect us to one crime because we're so many different gangs, but we're also one gang.
Intergang.
Exactly. And they also, because of how much money Bruno makes and because of deals that Bruno made with Lex, they have all this advanced weaponry that makes them more of a threat to Superman than just being a regular gang. And it's just interesting to see that they're carrying handguns and they're shooting a giant metal duck with handguns, which makes the line from the gang members so much funnier because it's like, but it's a giant duck, sir.
We transition to Lois Lane in her apartment. She lives in some very, very nice penthouse type thing, and she's doing her hair and filing her nails, and she's on the phone with, I assume it's Perry, declaring that Mannheim is missing, only to hear her doorbell ring, and she assumes it's her dinner, so she hangs up and heads to the door. And as she answers the door, she looks left and right, doesn't see anybody, but looks down and sees a present. And she takes it back inside, and I love the line, and she's like, please let it be flowers, please let it be flowers. And I was like, oh, has this happened before? Like, have you received some mysterious packages in the past? Which I believe it for Lois, because she makes a lot of enemies.
She was anticipating something a whole lot different. She's probably received threats through the mail, and she's probably received a lot of different things that a lot of different reporters receive, especially ones of her caliber. She was expecting something a little bit more dangerous than what she got. She was definitely hoping for those flowers.
As she unwraps the box, she opens it to find a little fairy doll, and once she lifts it out of the box, the doll opens her eyes, introduces herself as Princess Nighty-Night, waves her wand around, sprinkles some pixie dust, and then it puts Lois to sleep, telling her Nighty-Night and then closing her eyes. Once Lois wakes up, she's in a new location. She's been dressed up head to toe like a doll. She has makeup on. She has little mittens on her hand that don't have individual fingers.
Yeah.
And she hears the Toyman beckon to her in his sing-song voice. And he says it 3 times. He's like, oh, Miss Lane. And I'm like, oh. And she walks towards the voice, only for the audience to realize that she is in a life-size dollhouse, like a bisected house, so you can see into the rooms. And she's on the 3rd floor. And Toyman tells her to come out to play. I really like this version of Lois Lane, especially after watching Superman 1 through 4, the live-action movies. It kind of felt, and I understand what they were going for, Lois was the largest perpetrator as to why she got into the worst kinds of situations that she could get into. But in this, she was literally just doing her job, and she got wrapped up in this entire mess. And I'm like, I really like that. Because she's not like some damsel in distress. She wrote an article, and then someone got upset about it and kidnapped her.
Lois has a bad habit of both getting herself into these bad situations, like she did in the previous episode, but she also just randomly gets wrapped up in it, whether it's because of the fact that she wrote or said something that somebody didn't like, or it's just, well, Superman normally shows up to save you, so I'm going to kidnap you just because of that. It's just bad timing.
I feel like this is incredible woman representation. Imagine doing your job so well that you're singled out as a threat. That's girl power.
Yeah. In my mind, the epitome of girl power for comics is both Lois Lane and Selena Kyle. They are the epitome of a girl can do anything that she wants, and ain't not a darn thing that is out there that can stop her.
Ain't not a darn thing.
They're both just such fantastic characters, especially Lois. Lois gets put through the ringer in just about anything that she is involved in because of the fact that she is married to the most powerful man on the planet.
Arguably, the universe.
Arguably the multiverse. Our main Superman has beaten other Supermen from other parts of the multiverse. So arguably, the Superman that is with Lois Lane is the most powerful Superman that we have.
So, back at the Daily Planet, Jimmy and Clark are wondering where Lois could be, drawing parallels between both Mannheim missing and now she's gone missing. Clark wonders what the link between Mannheim and Toyman are, only for Jimmy to introduce a cross-referencing function on their computers. I guess I can't name many adaptations of Jimmy Olsen, but I really like this adaptation of Jimmy Olsen. He's pretty useful. He's not treated like the kid. I know that he's younger than everybody else, and he is probably lower on the food chain within their workplace. But He has a function, he does his job well, and he's brought along because he does his job well. But Jimmy introduces the cross-referencing function on their computers, and we cut back to Toyman and Lois Lane. This portion of the episode cuts between Toyman and Lois and Clark and Jimmy. And another detail that I really, really like, it comes up as it begins to switch back and forth, and you'll understand why. Back with Toyman and Lois Lane, Lois begins to question why her, and Toyman says it's because of the lies she wrote about him, and this time he wants her to get it right. Cuts back to Jimmy and Clark, and Jimmy can't find anything between Toyman and Mannheim, and Clark tells Jimmy to try to cross-reference Mannheim and just Toy. It brings up that there was a toy maker that was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Back with Toyman, he reveals a children's pop-up book to regale the sad story about a toy maker, one that most people have forgotten. And as I was bringing up, I really like it's very clever for what they're about to do. Toyman begins to narrate a story, page by page, of the picture book. Once upon a time, there lived a toy maker who loved nothing more than making toys. He wanted to build the most wonderful toy factory in the world, only he had no money for it. Then a man came along, a very bad man. And like I brought up in the Last Laugh episode with Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy, I didn't even check to see who the voice actor for Toyman is. He's really, really good. He has a lot of levels to him.
Oh, yeah. He reminds me a lot of Mark in a lot of ways, in the way that Mark portrays the Joker. And he also reminds me of the way that... Have you watched Doom Patrol?
Yeah.
The guy who plays Mr. Nobody. The way that he has so many different levels to Mr. Nobody that it's just very interesting, the level of dynamic. And he reminds me a lot of those two characters specifically and their voice actors. And it's very cool to see that because, especially at this point, we didn't have a lot to base an idea of Toyman off of. This is really the first idea of Toyman that anybody really has.
I believe they knock it out of the park.
I 100% agree.
But Toyman says a very bad man, and on the page it shows Bruno Mannheim, and then he pulls a little tab, and it reveals devil horns and a little tail. And he tells Lois that he offered to pay for the factory under one condition. And then it transitions to Clark reading an old article stating that the factory became a front for a numbers racket. Although Bruno Mannheim was never named a suspect, he was never indicted, only the toy maker, Winslow Schott, was convicted. And then we transition back to the Toyman. Toyman continues narrating the story. The bad man watched and laughed while the police locked the kindly toy maker away in the dungeon forever. And he pulls another tab and it drops prison bars on him and it says clang. And I was like, oh. And then we transition back to Clark, who believes that Schott's the Toyman, but Jimmy finds his obituary revealing that he never made it to his parole. Clark points out, I tried to think of an alternative way to phrase it, but it's not incorrect. But Clark points out that he had a survivor. I understand. It's just a strange way to refer to a son that lost their dad in prison.
Yeah, I felt like that way too when I was listening to it. It was kind of weird, but at the same time, when they write obituaries, a lot of times it seems like they always write, this person was survived by. So in a way, I understand why they wrote it the way they did. But it still feels kind of weird to be the way that you would refer, oh, this guy had a kid.
It's not bad. Nothing's wrong with it. It just, I was really trying to figure out a different way to word it, but I was like, it doesn't not make sense.
Right. It makes sense, but it doesn't. And for a kid's show, nobody's really going to question it.
Yep. We transition back to the toy maker who reveals the toy maker had a son. But without his father, the poor little boy was bounced from foster home to foster home like a toy that nobody wanted. A childhood is a terrible thing to lose, Miss Lois Lane, but I'm getting it back with a vengeance. And I'm like, oh. And I noted that the voice actor goes from very innocent to malicious and sinister very, very well. I felt some heartstrings tug a little bit when he said, a childhood is a terrible thing to lose. And I'm like, oof. After watching so much Batman, I was like, oof.
Yeah, I felt the heartstrings tug a little bit with that, and then you feel that malicious intent of with a vengeance. The delivery of lines in both of these shows, especially from specific characters, they just come out so well. Even if it's like a really corny joke, like a really corny pun, like Toyman had so many corny puns in this episode. But because of the delivery of the line, it just makes it that much better. And it's something that you can laugh at no matter how old you are.
I appreciate that even though, and the same was with the Joker, even though they are corny, because of how they are delivered, it is unsettling some of the things that they say. Even though I'm like, that's a silly line. That person made it not silly anymore.
Right. We both have a background in acting, and it's funny thinking about the fact that a different actor, a different voice can make a line sound completely different. Like if I were to play a character and then you were to play a character after me, and we were to play the same character, we would both have a completely different take of the character.
Correct.
And it would change the character entirely.
I want to bring up the acting thing. It's very true. I remember back in high school, I was in a production of a musical called the 25th Annual Putnam Spelling Bee, and my character was homeschooled, and he was kind of special. I wore a cape and a Ninja Turtles bicycle helmet, and I'd watched some other portrayals of the character I was, Leaf Coney Bear, and I was like, how can I make this more fun for me? Because if I wasn't having fun acting it, I feel like something would be lost in translation towards an audience. And the theater hall pass was a little toy horse, and it was just sitting on the stage, and one day I grabbed it, and whenever Leaf Coney Bear was called to the stage to spell his word, I grabbed the little horse, and I trotted over with the little horse, and my teacher was like, keep that. And I was like, thank you. But it's a very good point. It just gives me creepy crawlies, and Joker was doing it too. And as Kevin said, the last laugh, there were a lot of moments where it's just like, I can tell that this is early Mark Hamill in his Joker career, but he's already in his second episode as being the Joker. He's starting to nail it.
Oh yeah. It's one of those things where when you develop a feeling for a character, once you develop that, it makes it a whole lot easier to fall back into that character. And it also can depend. I know I've watched interviews with Mark where he's talked about the fact that he doesn't feel like the Joker unless Kevin is Batman.
Which is fair.
He would find it a whole lot more difficult to find the Joker again, which is why he has retired as the Joker now that we've lost Kevin.
Rest in peace.
I know. It's so sad. He's talked about how he couldn't be the Joker if Kevin wasn't Batman. It's interesting to think about the fact that if anyone else had been Batman or if anyone else had been the Joker, would we remember either of those characters the way that we do now?
I don't believe we would. I really don't.
It's just like if we didn't have Tim Daly as Superman and we didn't have Clancy Brown as Lex. But it's just one of those things where would we appreciate these shows as much if it had been different actors?
I'm going back to the episode, but I wonder who the initial competition might have been against Mark Hamill when going for the Joker, or if there was no competition going.
With how superheroes were at the time, we might not have ever experienced any of the people that also sat in the chair that Mark Hamill had to sit in to audition.
So, back to the episode. Sorry for the very long tangent. Adam and I are good at that. We see Superman leaving the Daily Planet, and we transition back to Toyman. We see the Toyman leading Lois Lane out of the dollhouse, claiming that the real fun is about to begin, and that she's going to play reporter. And I was like, oh, again, just incredible voice acting. And then he hands her a little notepad. As they're walking through the toy warehouse, hanging from the ceiling with various other puppets, Bruno Mannheim is lowered in a prison outfit. And as he wakes up, he just starts calling Toyman all sorts of names, telling him that he's made a big mistake and that he's got friends that will find him. Only for Toyman, he doesn't respond. He just takes a remote control, and a toy soldier firing squad lines up and takes aim at Bruno. And then he's like, then again, I'm willing to barter a deal. I was like, oh no.
Opportunist. Opportunity.
Opportunity curve. This part is the darkest this episode got, and also kind of gave me slight chills, where Toyman approaches Bruno, and then he blindfolds him. And I'm like, oh my god. And then he orders the toy soldiers to take aim, and that's until Lois knocks over the toy soldiers, and it dominoes, and the rest of them fall down. And Toyman goes over to the toys, and he just begins to sob and starts shouting at Lois, and he's like, you broke my toys! And something like that.
The way that the voice acting is for that, the way that he changes...
He's very calm and collected for most of the episode.
And then now he's just so upset. It's so good because Toyman in the comics, in every iteration, everything he creates, he cares a great deal about. And it just speaks so much to how being a creator of anything, if you don't feel very strongly for it, what were you doing, you know? And it's one of those things where if somebody comes along and destroys something that you created, how would you feel? And he portrays that so well in Toyman's reaction to Lois pushing over the toys.
He shouts at Lois that she broke his toys and that she spoiled his fun, and he picks up one of the toy soldier's guns and aims at Lois until Superman swoops in from a vent and he steals the gun away, bends it, and he tells the Toyman that little boys shouldn't play with sharp objects. And it's another example of kind of a dumb line, but it's not when he says it.
Right.
With this opportunity, Lois rushes over to Mannheim and cuts him down, and the Toyman assures Superman that he has something for him, something that he can't break, as he opens a thing of like Play-Doh and he throws a sticky substance onto Superman. And Superman is less than amused. Like, he looks down, he's like, what? I think he was so not amused. He seemed almost amused. But that is until the substance begins to wrap around him, as Toyman informs him that he should have read the label, that this is a lethal biogenic organism, and that contact with the skin will prove fatal. It won't stop growing until it asphyxiates the host. Lois rushes towards Superman, but he tells her not to touch him and to hide behind something. And Superman begins to spin at super speed, causing the substance to fly off of him. This destroys a bunch of the toys surrounding them, and it's another, like, the levels. I can't say it enough. The levels of Toyman, because, like, he shrieks at Superman. He calls him a cheater, but he isn't worried. As he states, you think you've got me, but I still get a free game. And I think that's a really good line. He slinks into the shadows, and he has a remote control. He presses a button, and toy bombs begin to rain from the ceiling, and then they begin to tick down. Superman then grabs Lois and Bruno and flies out of the building, escaping the explosion. Outside the building, it's revealed they're at some sort of like farmhouse with toy farm animals outside that also get caught up in the explosion, which is super duper freaky. Like, I like horror. I'm a very big horror fan. The man in the doll outfit, already a red flag. But the fact that once we see the outside of this warehouse, if you're driving a car past this place, you see a farmhouse and a bunch of animals. But if you stop and investigate, none of the animals are real. And that's freaky.
It's really freaky. If I saw that in real life, I would be very hard-pressed to get as far away from there as possible. I would cross oceans to get away from there. Like, that just strikes me as somewhere that no one should ever willingly be. Or unwillingly.
Or unwilling.
It's like what you would imagine those nuclear towns, like, where they would test the nuclear bombs. It's like one of those. And it's like, should I be here right now? Is something about to set off?
Speaking of setting off, I love the explosion animations in this episode. I hope that they continue to be as cool, which I assume they will. All the explosions in this episode look so cool.
They really did. The animators do a really good job in this show of making it look really, really good. They do a really great job of drawing and animating for this show and for Batman the Animated Series. I know they're not the same animators, but at the same time, it's just they both do such a fantastic job of making the show enjoyable. Because a lot of times the effects in a show, no matter how well it's written, the effects can take you out of the show almost immediately.
Correct.
So to have really good effects to back up really talented voice acting, and to compound on top of that really good writing that can be appreciated no matter how young or old you are. Because, I mean, we're watching this at adult ages.
Yes, adult ages. That's where we'll keep it.
We're watching this as adults. Shows that we enjoyed as kids and still enjoying it almost as much as we did then. It almost makes you wish that there was a button you could press to forget that you ever watched it to begin with, just so that you could experience it for the first time one more time.
So afterwards, the police show up, and Clark is with Lois, making sure that she's okay. I like this. Lois reassures Clark that the Toyman's a sicko, but she still feels sorry for him. Only for Bruno to intervene, calling him a loser and a freak just like his father, and that this is a funeral that he'd skip. Until a cop informs them that his men couldn't find a body, but they did find the remnants of the Toyman's toy head, and then the episode ends. Really cool ending. Really good. Pacing-wise, sure, you can argue that it wraps up kind of fast, but I think they crammed a lot into this episode that worked very well.
Oh, yeah. And I really like the idea that they went very original with their version of the Toyman.
Mm-hmm.
In the comics, the Toyman is actually Winslow Schott. Every time he appears, it's the real guy. But in this show, and in all of Toyman's appearances after this, you never know if you're seeing Toyman or if you're seeing a toy version of Toyman.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So the entirety of the show and the entirety of every other appearance afterwards, you never know if you've ever actually seen Toyman.
Well, that's the end of the episode. Any closing thoughts?
I want to go back to the scene in the park where it's kind of also interesting the fact that the split-second decision that Clark has to make to let Lois pull him, like, he has to decide that in a second. Like, there's no preparation. He has to feel somebody touch him and then be ready to be pulled. That's an interesting thing for somebody as strong as he is. It's also funny the amount of times that people try to pull Clark Kent out of danger.
If only they knew.
They don't know that it's Superman. It's just like an inside joke between Clark and the audience. That, like, yeah, these people are pulling Clark Kent out of danger, not realizing that it's Superman.
Oh no, Clark Kent's in danger again.
Right. And it's just such an interesting thing that, like, yeah, Clark Kent's in danger. He's really not in danger. He's not in any danger ever. But at the same time, these people legitimately worry about him. And it's funny because even in the comics, after people find out, after he tells people who he is, they still, like, instinctively do things to protect him, even though they're like, he doesn't need any protecting. It just shows how much people in Clark's life actually care about him.
Clark Kent's the real best actor.
Oh, yeah. Most definitely. I always found it funny. Somebody brought up on the internet once, I've seen it a couple of times, where it would be really funny to have somebody order a hit on Clark Kent the reporter.
Yeah.
It would be a really funny comedy movie to have the hit fail the entire time and nobody understands why Clark won't die.
That would be a really fun, like, World's Finest type thing, because then you can have Superman genuinely not know who has ordered this hit on him, so he goes to the world's greatest detective to go, like, I have to protect my alter ego, but also I'm being hunted.
Right, and I'm not being hunted because I'm Superman. I'm being hunted because I'm Clark Kent. They're going after me because I'm actually a good reporter. They're not going after me because they figured out that I'm Superman.
Well, all in all, this episode, much like BTAS, they started with a lot of obscure villains. Like, you ask any random Superman fan who Toyman is, unless they've seen this show, where they probably don't know who Toyman is.
Right. In a way, the comics treat Toyman as more of a villain of the week. And even in any of his iterations that have been in, whether it be live action, whether it be animation, they treat him more as a villain of the week, except for in the DCAU, where he's not so much a villain of the week. He appears several times. It's very interesting.
1 second. Here's some quick nomenclature. BTAS, Batman the Animated Series. STAS, Superman the Animated Series. DCAU, the DC Animated Universe. Carry on.
So, the DCAU does a lot of the characters that they use justice because they don't treat them as villains of the week. They appear multiple times, and they don't do the same thing every time. They're not after the same thing every time.
Yes.
Except for, like, the rare, Mr. Freeze is always going to be after the same thing.
Save the wife.
His main priority is Nora.
Save the cheerleader, save the world.
Oh, my Lord, heroes. But it's interesting because, sure, all of Superman's villains are out for one main thing, to beat Superman. But they do it in a different way, and they have different reasons for why each time. And it's the same thing with BTAS. They want to beat Batman, and they want to accomplish this specific goal. But the goal is never the same every time. For example, when Scarecrow appears in BTAS, he doesn't appear for the same reason every time. He has different reasonings. The Joker isn't doing the same scheme every time. He's doing something different.
They have motive. They have ambition.
Right. And they're being treated with the respect that they deserve, not necessarily as just, oh, well, this is a character that we're just going to introduce this once and then you'll never see them again. They do that really well with Toyman because in the DCAU, he appears a lot. He appears pretty frequently after this. And he has a pretty major role in Superman the Animated Series, in Justice League, and then again in Justice League Unlimited.
Well, I'm excited to see Toyman again. It's not a one-to-one recommendation, but I do know that in Dark Knight's Metal, the first 5-6 pages has Toyman, but it's not the same Toyman. It's like Hero something. It's a Japanese kid who's the Toyman, and he's been kidnapped by Mongol. I'd recommend Batman Metal, Dark Knight's Metal to anybody. I think that's my favorite comic of all time, but besides the point, maybe by the next time Toyman has shown up, I'll look up to see if there are any notable Toyman stories with Superman, but off the top of my head, not too sure.
I don't know a lot of his appearances in the comics. This makes me partly feel like a little bit of I'm failing as a Superman fan. He's just a very obscure villain, and most of my appreciation for Toyman comes from his characterization in the DCAU, because he's such a notable character, and they use him frequently, and they use him well. They don't play around with it. He's such a well-written character, such a well-voiced character in every appearance that he has. My favorite appearance of his, unfortunately, we don't get to until Justice League. A lot of my favorite appearances from some of these characters don't happen until Justice League or Justice League Unlimited. But my favorite appearance of his happens in Justice League, where he thinks he killed Superman. It makes the Justice League angry, and it's like he legitimately feels fear that he never felt before, and you can see it even though his face is a piece of plastic. You can see it in his face that, I made a mistake. Superman never treated me like this. Hold on.
Oh, Batman. I think that's the true relevance, the true substance of the DCAU. Because it is a serialized television show, they're able to give all the miscellaneous rogues of both Batman and Superman. At the end of my episodes, I'm trying to not just recommend a comic, but try and recommend something relevant to this villain. But a lot of the love, if this strikes somebody, if they're like, oh, I like the idea of this villain, maybe I want to read a comic about them. Because I love the comic form, and I want other people to love it. But I think that is the greatest boon of the DCAU, the ability for them to expand upon so much for these characters that don't get the same kind of love and respect in the comics sometimes.
Right. I think anybody listening that feels like they want to learn more about Toyman, I definitely recommend that they definitely should look into it. Because even in the comics, he's I can't think of any major stories off the top of my head, but just his characterization in every form. He's such an obscure character, which allows for writers for them to play with the characterization a lot more, which allows for more creative storytelling. And I really appreciate their ability to make the character enjoyable even though they're changing some of the characterization. For example, there's Supergirl, because Winslow Schott shows up in Supergirl as the first love interest for Kara, because it's Winslow Schott Jr., which is different from Winslow Schott Sr., which is the Toyman. But in the comics, Jr. does become Toyman at some point, and then the mantle passes on to Hero, and Hero, he's not necessarily a villain, but he's also not a hero. Matter of fact, if you're interested in the Hero version of Toyman versus the Winslow Schott version, you can watch Superman Batman Public Enemy. He appears in that as a main protagonist for a little bit in that film, and it's actually a really good experience for the character.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for attending this. That's the episode. I hope that if anybody listens to this, they can like it, share it, leave a comment. If somebody listens to this and knows a Toyman story that I do not, say that. But thank you very much for your time, and we will be here next time. I don't know what the next episode's called, but I'll see you after 2 Batman episodes.
I'll see you then.
All right. Bye, Adam.